Hello everyone, this is João from Salmonella Place with another anatomy tutorial where I'm going to talk about the two main bones that you find in your forearm. And these are the ulna and the radius, and I'm going to isolate here to show you that the radius is located laterally and the ulna is located medially. And you can clearly see here that the radius is a bit shorter than the ulna, clearly seen on this model. Now I'm going to get back here so I can isolate the radius, and so we can start talking about this bone first. Now there are three main parts that we need to divide the radius, so we can talk about them separately. The first one is the proximal extremity, which, as you can see here, is the one closest to the shoulder or to the center of your body or your skeleton. And then we're going to look at the shaft that is located between the proximal extremity and the other extremity that we're going to discuss, which is the distal extremity, which is located a little bit further away from the shoulder, as you can see here. Now let's talk about the proximal extremity, which I'm zooming in right now. And here you can see a few structures. The first one is the head. So this is the head of the radius. Then you will find an articular facet which continues into the articular circumference. And then you see here the neck, which is a bit more distal than the head. So the neck should be located right here. And then between the neck and the shaft, you will find the radial tuberosity, which is what you see here. This protrusion right here. This is the radial tuberosity. So now that we looked at the proximal extremity, it's time for us to look at the shaft of the radius. And there are a few twists and turns, as you can see here as I rotate. And for that matter, there are a few surfaces and borders that we need to define on this bone. And let's start with the one that exists medially, and it is found between the two bones, hence the name. It's the interosseous border, which is found around here. Now, the other surface, let's say, that you will find is known as the anterior surface, around here, which then has a border, which will be then called the anterior border. And a little bit laterally, you will find a lateral border around here. Now we're looking at the bone anteriorly. Let's move all the way to the posterior view so I can show you that it also has a posterior border around here, which is the boundary between the lateral and posterior surfaces. And the posterior surface should be around here, as you can see. Now let's talk about the distal extremity, which I'm zooming in right here. And we're looking at the anterior view. So this is the interior view of the distal extremity of the radius. And we find here one structure here known as the styloid process, which is found along the suprastyloid crest. Now you also notice here where there's going to be the articulation between the radius and the carpal bones, or the bones in your wrist, and this is known as the carpal articular surface, which is found then directly at the distal portion of the radius. Now let's look at the posterior view here, and the posterior view, you can see clearly here this notch, let's say, which is the ulnar notch, which is found medially to the styloid process. Now we're still on the distal extremity of the radius on the posterior view, as you can see here, because we need to talk about well-developed grooves, which are structures where the tendons of the long extensor muscles should pass through. And here on this 3D model, you cannot see them clearly, so that's why I'm going to highlight them right now. Now the first groove, you should find it around here, and this is found laterally, as you can see, and on the styloid process that we talked about. And here is where the tendons of the abductor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis muscles should pass through. And you can see that I'm showing some images of these muscles, so you can have a clear idea where you can find them and how they end up passing through these grooves. Now, the second groove should be found around here, and on this groove, this is where the tendons of the extensor carpi radialis longus and also the brevis muscles pass through. Now, the third groove should be found around here, and on this groove, as you can see, it's an oblique line where the tendon of the extensor pollicis longus muscle passes through. Now the final groove is the fourth groove, which should be found right next to the third groove, a little bit more medially, and here lies the tendons of the extensor digitorum and extensor indicis muscles. Now if I clear this out and I move a little bit, so you will notice a structure or an elevation around here, and this is known as the dorsal tubercle, and this is a bony ridge found just right next to the third groove, and it's usually palpable. You can actually palpate this on your body. You can go ahead and try it now. Now we're going to talk about the ulna. As you can see here, is located medially. And I'm zooming in so I can show you that there are three parts that we're going to look at. The first one is the proximal extremity. Then we're going to look at the shaft, and then also the distal extremity. Now let's look at the proximal extremity, zooming in, so I can show you the first structure that you can clearly see on the posterior view. So I'm turning it so you can see the posterior view, and this structure is known as the olecranon, which is a hook shaped and curved process, as you can notice here, and it has a rough surface. Now the other structure, if I turn a little bit more, I will see the trochlear notch, which goes all the way to form a process, this process here known as the coronoid process. Now I'm turning it around, and now you can have an anterior view of the ulna, but a little bit more laterally. You notice here a slight depression, and this is known as the radial notch. And the radial notch is located laterally, as I mentioned, and is articulating with the head of the radius, and you can see that the head of the radius is here transparent, a little bit more transparent, and is articulating with the radial notch. Now the other structure that you can clearly see here is located right where the shaft originates, and this is known as the ulnar tuberosity. You see here an elevation, and this is the ulnar tuberosity. Now if you turn a little bit more laterally, you will find a crest, and this is known as the supinator crest, which looks like an extension of the radial notch. Now we're going to talk about the shaft of the ulna, and the shaft is between the proximal extremity and the distal extremity, so this long structure here. And as I twist around, if I rotate, you can see that there are a few twists and turns on this bone, and for that matter we need to discuss briefly the surfaces and also the borders that exist between the surfaces on the ulna. Now let's do it by highlighting, and the first one that you see here is a border that exists between the two bones. It's found laterally. For that matter, we'll call it the interosseous border, somewhere around here. Now let me clear this out and show you the anterior surface. This is the anterior surface of the ulna, or the shaft of the ulna. And now, separating the anterior surface from the medial surface is a border, and the border is known as the anterior border. It should be found around here. Now, clearing this out, I'm going to rotate so you can start seeing the medial surface. So this is the medial surface of the ulna. Now there is another surface, the posterior surface, which is separated from the medial surface by a posterior border, and it should be found around here. And then let's rotate again this bone and find the last border that I just talked about, the posterior border, which should be, not the border, sorry, the posterior surface of the ulna. That should be here. So a little bit tricky, but just think about, we rotated and found borders separating three main surfaces. So we're still on the shaft of the ulna, and I didn't want to miss an important structure that is known as the nutrient foramen. And it should be found somewhere around here on the anterior surface, and right about the middle of the anterior surface. Now, moving on and clearing out this structure and moving on to the distal portion or extremity of the ulna, you can see here, still on the anterior view, you can see the head. It's known as the head, and the head contains two important structures. The first one is the articular circumference, located right here, which is more evident anteriorly. And as we turn or rotate, you can see here a projection. This is known as the styloid process and is projected distally, and is a little bit more evident when you look at it posteriorly. Now it's time for us to finish this tutorial, and I'm going to do so by talking about the articulations that are happening between the ulna and the radius and other bones that are in contact or articulating with the radius and the ulna. Now the first articulation or joint is known as the humeroradial joint, also part of the elbow joint, and it's happening between the capitulum of the humerus right here and the head of the radius, you can see here. Now if I turn a little bit more laterally, I'm going to find another articulation, and this articulation is known as the proximal radio-ulnar joint, and it's happening between the circumference of the head of the radius and also the radial notch that you find on the ulna right here. Now the next joint, or the next articulation, should be found a little bit more distally, and this one is known as the distal radio-ulnar joint, and it's happening between the ulnar notch that you find in the radius and the head of the ulna. Now the next articulation, the fourth articulation where the radius is involved, is the wrist joint. Very important joint in your body. And this joint, the articulating surfaces of this joint, is the carpal articulating surface of the radius, this area here, and two wrist bones, the scaphoid, as you see here, and the lunate, which are also known as the proximal carpal bones. Now let's talk about articulations that you find within the ulna. And the first one, which is pretty evident here and part of the elbow joint as well, is happening between the trochlear notch of the ulna here and the trochlea of the humerus. And this is known as the humero-ulnar joint. Now, as we don't have to talk about it because I just mentioned two joints where both the radius and the ulnar are involved with, and these are the proximal radial-ulnar joint and the distal radial-ulnar joint, Now, another important structure here, another important joint and articulation is happening between the olecranon process of the ulna, which is then articulating here with this depth here, or this fossa of the humerus, which is known as the olecranon fossa. And then this is also an articulation that is happening between the humerus and the ulna. Now, it's important to mention, very important thing to know, is that the ulna, as you can see here, is not part of the wrist joint because it is excluded from this joint, or the wrist joint, by an articular disc, so it's not directly involved in the wrist joint.